debt are foreign governments and central banks. Let me also explicitly say we knew that and we debated that. Rightly or wrongly, it was decided within the committee that the Chinese central bank did not deserve priority preference over anybody else. We weren't unaware of it. It was just a choice that was made. Also, there was a bigger concern, I think, and this to me I think was a very big concern at Treasury, was that if you were to impose losses on GSE creditors, then anybody else out there who might be enjoying some sort of implied guarantee would probably lose it. I take the flip side of it is where I often have said, if we're not going to liquidate Freddie, we're not going to liquidate Citi, where I think the flip side of it is, if you liquidate Freddie, you just might liquidate Citi. So I do think that there's the perception during a crisis that you were to eliminate those implied guarantees and other implied guarantees would indeed be called into question. And of course, there's probably maybe the more subjective and harder to measure is if you were to impose losses on GSE creditors, would everybody just simply panic? And I felt like that was certainly the tougher concern to get around and deal with. But again, I think that's a primary driver here. I think that actually, to me, that's the most important concern. I've often quipped that maybe at the Federal Reserve we need a group of psychologists rather than economists, so we can ask the market how it feels and if it would relax a little bit. But again, to me, those are the primary reasons of why we didn't invoke a receivership. I will say I do not find any of them to be so compelling as to ignore the clear statutory intent. But I do think that they were compelling both with Treasury and FHFA. And again, these were all issues that we explicitly debated and rejected. So I want to get to me, a bigger question, the lessons that what does this mean to me for the resolution of SIFIs in general? And what I would say is the biggest thing to me is that there were certain issues that Congress actually considers and rejects. There might be tools that a regulator wishes they had, but they were not given by Congress. That does not mean they were intended to be given. That might be that Congress decided that this is the choice we should make. And so one of my biggest concerns with the orderly resolution process of Dodd-Frank is I'm not optimistic that despite the fact that I do see those tools as a path to impose losses on creditors, I have very little confidence that will be done. So again, how do we make sure that the congressional intent, in this case, where I think was actually appropriate, does not actually get followed? So to me, and I know that one of your sister banks has recently had a conference on the culture of banks. I think there needs to be a culture in the regulatory community, quite frankly, change. And I think I would characterize it this way. The current culture, in my opinion, is a quote-unquote whatever it takes. And I know that sounds very exciting, but to me, I think it needs to shift to maybe whatever the law allows, or maybe even better, whatever the law directs. And so again, I think there needs to be a far more transparent process where we respect the rule of law and we carry out the intentions of Congress, whether it's good or bad. And if Congress puts horrible laws that have horrible results, it's Congress that must pay responsibility for that. And I would argue, say in a much broader sense to me, one of the long-term cumulative effects of this crisis, in my opinion, is that having regulatory entities engaged in legislative activity has eroded the political independence of those agencies. I think it has made them political targets, and I think that to me, is an inevitable consequence of regulators invading into legislative territory. So again, if you don't want to be second-guessed, don't second-guess the legislature. I'll only give you an example from the history again in the GSE context. The Bush administration proposed having the new GSE regulator be part of the Treasury Department. That was widely debated and widely bipartisan rejected. There wasn't one vote of support for having that on Capitol Hill. Congress also made the choice to have Treasury's role in GSE be quite limited. And so it doesn't take much to read the several speeches from Treasury Secretary Paulson and others to glean, and Secretary Paulson makes this quite clear in his book On the Brink. Treasury was one of the prime motivators behind the policy of conservatorship. There is zero basis in statute for Treasury taking that authority. And so to me, if we want to maintain the independence of regulators, it must not only be the independence from politicians in the congressional branch, it has to be politicians in the executive branch. Why bother to have independent regulators if they're simply going to take orders from the Treasury Department? And to me, again, this is not something where this is just sort of missed by Congress. We greatly, again, debated the role of Treasury, and we decided to create one that was quite constrained regardless of what Treasury wanted. And so again, I worry that we're going to see, particularly the FSOC process, my biggest concern is we've essentially, I guess I'll go back to me, I felt like maybe I'll name what was not supposed to be named at lunch when we talked about the rogue regulators. I don't think it's, quite frankly, the role of Treasury to intervene itself over an agency like the SEC or the CFTC that are independent agencies. So to me, the broader question of the independence of regulators in both the executive branch and the congressional branch need to be really decided. So rather than trying to be a bit just leaving on a bad note and leaving quite dire, what are some possible solutions to kind of get around this? And I'll wrap up with these. First of all, as long as we're in an age of very discretionary powers, personnel is policy. So to me, until there are appropriate limits on place, I'd like to channel, say, Rogoff's model of a conservative central banker and apply that prudential regulators. I'm of the opinion, and certainly would say this to my friends on Capitol Hill, that the Senate should reject any nominee for a bank regulatory power that just doesn't absolutely detest bailouts and would rather shoot himself in the head than bail a bank out. That to me should be the bar. That could be the question. Will you shoot yourself in the head before you bail a bank? If not, I will not vote for it. So again, I do think that we have to raise the bar in terms of having to make sure we get. And I'll certainly say as an aside on that, I certainly ask myself, as I'm sure many of you ask yourself, if I had been sitting in like the GSEs. I simply don't know. But I do think you need to start with the premise of having somebody who absolutely tells themselves they don't want to do that. I worry as an aside too, and I worry particularly when we hear discussions about Lehman. Often part of the Lehman context is only we had the appropriate tools to rescue it. I very much worry that that sort of discussion sends signals to the marketplace of, well, if we had the right tools, we would have rescued it, which means we'll do that next time. I do worry, and again, I get the sort of siege mentality, I get the public criticism, but I do worry that when regulators essentially take victory laps after rescues, that it sends a signal to the marketplace that rescues will be forthcoming next time. And I really think that that's a discussion. Even if you think that every decision made in 2008 is the correct one, I think it's inappropriate for us to say that publicly. So maybe in that regard, we need to go back to constructive ambiguity. Let me end with saying a lot of undoing too big to fail has to deal with the capital standards as well as the regulatory environment. So I'll end with, to me, what was a very disappointing meeting I had back in 2004, where I sat across the table from some of the senior staff at FDIC and queried them on whether they concerned that commercial bank holdings of GSE securities were over 150% of Tier 1 capital. I thought that was a pretty high concentration for one class of risk. And the response to me was, that's not our problem. You have to look at this, any financial system that decides that Fannie Mae is risk-free or Greek sovereign debt is risk-free, to me, is a financial system that is designed to fail. And so we do need to worry that if you're creating regulations that assume, and let me say, the FDIC had zero basis to treat Fannie and Freddie debt as risk-free. The law says now, as it does then, that there is no statutory guarantee. And so I do think that regulators should not second guess whether institutions are going to be bailed out. We should treat them as they will not be bailed out and that their creditors will take losses, and that we should not encourage banks to hold lots of their securities. So again, to me, I leave with my skepticism is that I think we've probably doubled down on too big to fail in a much greater way than we wanted. I think we've eroded the rule of law in many ways, and I think we've engaged in a variety of ad hoc bailouts. That to me, I am afraid have set a really bad tone for the next crisis. So with that, maybe on a happier note, I'll turn it over to the other Mark.